In 1897, deep within the rolling hills of Sussex, England, the Harrington estate stood as a beacon of privilege and excess. Its grand halls were lined with imported marble, its rooms adorned with velvet drapery, and its gardens designed to mimic the finest courts of Europe. On a late autumn evening, the Harrington family opened their doors for a banquet that promised to outshine every gathering before it. Golden candelabras flickered in the dining hall, their flames dancing across silverware polished to a mirror's gleam. The scent of roasted pheasant, spiced wine, and sugared fruits drifted through the corridors, mingling with the notes of a string quartet. To the guests, it was the pinnacle of refinement, a night where wealth and status shimmered brighter than the stars above. Yet, by dawn, those same halls lay in ruins. Charred stone, blackened timber, and silence broken only by the crackle of cooling embers. The official story was swift and simple. A kitchen fire, unchecked, had swept through the manor with devastating speed. But whispers in the village carried a different weight. Nearly every member of the household perished except for one, the servant Thomas Gray. He was said to have escaped into the woods, his hands blackened with soot, his eyes wide with terror. Some believed he had caused the blaze, finally striking back against years of cruelty and humiliation. Others insisted he was merely a survivor of chance, chosen by fate to carry the burden of the estate's last night. The courts declared the fire accidental, closing the case with little fanfare. Yet the people of Sussex were not so quick to forget, nor to forgive. In taverns and churches behind locked doors they spoke of vengeance, of curses, and of flames that moved as though guided by unseen hands, for there were details too strange to dismiss. Guests who had staggered into the night swore they saw shapes moving within the fire, not human, not natural, but something spectral, dancing in the inferno as if celebrating the destruction. Some claimed to hear voices singing, though the language was foreign, guttural, and unearthly. Others muttered that the Harringtons had long carried sins that wealth alone could not hide. Ruthless business dealings, broken promises to their tenants, whispers of cruelty within their own walls. The banquet, they said, was no feast. It was a summoning, a final indulgence before debts came due. To the faithful, the fire was punishment. To the skeptical, it was the desperate act of a beaten man. Yet both sides agreed on one point. Something more than accident had unfolded that night. This documentary returns to that smoldering ruin, piecing together fragments of testimony, records, and folklore. Was it a servant's vengeance? Was it divine retribution? Or was it something far older, a presence that had waited patiently in the shadows until that night of fire and revelry? The Harrington estate is gone, consumed by time and ash, but the questions remain, and perhaps within those questions lies the truth. The Harrington name had long carried weight in Sussex, whispered with a mixture of awe and resentment across generations. By the late 19th century, the family stood as one of the most influential dynasties in the county, their estate sprawling across fertile hills, their wealth woven into the very fabric of local society. They had built their fortune on a blend of agricultural dominance and industrial investments, ensuring that both the soil and the smoke of progress paid tribute to their name. To outsiders, the Harringtons represented the pinnacle of English aristocratic life. Elegant, well-educated, and endlessly capable of hosting grand gatherings that dazzled the social columns of London newspapers. But to those who lived in the shadow of their estate, who tilled their fields and scrubbed their halls, the Harringtons embodied something darker, a dynasty where privilege disguised cruelty, and where smiles often masked schemes. At the heart of this legacy stood Lord Edward Harrington, a man both admired and feared. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always impeccably dressed, he exuded the authority of a figure born to command. Yet beneath the polished exterior was a man who had inherited not only his father's fortune, but also his relentless drive to dominate. Edward had expanded the family's wealth through shrewd, some would say ruthless business dealings, buying out failing farms at insultingly low prices, investing in factories that cut corners on worker safety, and ensuring his competitors were crushed rather than challenged. His wife, Lady Margaret, offered the illusion of balance, a hostess of impeccable grace, known for her charity teas and her careful selection of silk gowns. But even she was rumored to view the estate staff as tools rather than people, demanding perfection in service and punishing failure with icy disdain. The Harrington children reflected the contradictions of their lineage. The eldest son, Charles, was groomed to inherit the estate. Educated at Oxford, he returned with lofty airs and a reputation for gambling debts quietly settled by the family fortune. The second son, William, displayed a more calculating intelligence, rumored to have overseen some of the harsher strategies in the family's business empire. Their daughter, Eliza, was considered the jewel of the family, a woman whose beauty filled gossip columns, though whispers suggested she too had inherited the Harrington appetite for manipulation. In portraits, the family appeared united, each gaze directed confidently toward the camera. But diaries from servants and quiet conversations in Sussex taverns painted a different picture, of rivalries at the dinner table, of whispered threats overheard in corridors, of a family bound not by love but by the iron chains of legacy. It was against this backdrop that the banquet of 1897 was planned. Lord Harrington intended it not merely as a celebration but as a declaration. Sussex had endured economic strain in the preceding years, and the family's reputation, though still formidable, had begun to crack under the weight of local resentment. Farmers displaced by Harrington acquisitions muttered of injustice, while servants spoke quietly of cruel dismissals and punishments that bordered on sadistic. Yet on the surface, the family insisted on projecting strength and unity. The banquet was announced with great fanfare, invitations delivered on embossed cards sealed with the family crest. Guests were promised an evening of unprecedented grandeur, a feast that would confirm the Harringtons as the undisputed rulers of their county domain. The preparations themselves became a spectacle. Newspapers reported on shipments of wine arriving from France, on deliveries of exotic fruits rarely seen outside London markets, and on musicians brought in from the capital to play for the guests. Servants worked day and night, polishing silver until their fingers blistered, scrubbing marble floors until they reflected the candelabras above. For the Harringtons, every detail was designed to display wealth, refinement, and power. But for those beneath them, it was an exercise in endurance, a performance under threat of punishment if even the smallest element fell short. What made the Harringtons' grandeur particularly unsettling was the thinly veiled tension beneath it. Locals recalled that the estate, though magnificent, felt heavy, its hallways dimly lit, its portraits depicting ancestors with cold, watchful eyes. Workers spoke of rooms they were forbidden to enter, locked chambers said to contain documents of past betrayals or heirlooms tied to darker family secrets. Rumors swirled that Lord Harrington had quarreled with his own brothers over inheritance years earlier, leaving relationships permanently severed. Even within the household, mistrust lingered. Servants whispered that Charles and William often argued bitterly about finances, that Eliza had threatened to leave the estate altogether, and that Lady Margaret had once wept openly in the gardens after a heated exchange with her husband. It was within this cauldron of wealth and discontent that the image of the Harringtons was crafted for public consumption. The family portrait hung in the estate's main hall, depicting them as serene, noble, and untouchable. Visitors saw elegance, locals saw arrogance, for while the Harringtons extended charity to the church and sponsored village fairs, many believed these gestures were merely strategies to quell dissent. Those displaced from their land or dismissed from service rarely forgot their grievances, and they carried those stories into the community. The Harrington legacy was thus twofold, one of admiration from afar and resentment up close. The banquet symbolized this duality more starkly than any other event. For some, it was to be remembered as the last great display of English aristocracy before the tide of modernity began to erode such dynasties. For others, it was a final act of hubris, a family flaunting its wealth even as whispers of rot echoed through its corridors. It is telling that when news of the estate's fiery destruction spread the following morning, reactions in the community were divided. Some wept for the loss of such a prominent family, lamenting the end of an era. Others muttered that justice had been served, that the flames had consumed not only the manor but the sins it concealed. To understand the Harrington fire, one must first understand this legacy. The polished marble masking cracks of cruelty, the banquet table groaning with delicacies even as servants starved in silence, the carefully orchestrated image of nobility, hiding the ruthless machinery of dominance. The Harringtons were, in many ways, a reflection of their time, a family born into privilege, determined to preserve it at any cost, and blind to the forces gathering at their gates. Whether the fire that destroyed them was accident, vengeance, or curse, its spark was kindled long before the banquet began. It was written into the very foundation of their estate, into the lives they exploited, and into the legacy they built brick by brick, gilded frame by gilded frame. And so the night of the feast became not only a spectacle of indulgence, but a stage for destiny. Guests arrived dazzled by the splendor, unaware that they were stepping into a house already trembling beneath the weight of its secrets. Servants carried platters of delicacies, their faces set in masks of obedience, even as whispers of rebellion stirred in their hearts. The Harringtons smiled, raised their goblets, and welcomed their peers, confident that their name would outlive the evening. Yet history would remember the Harringtons not for their wealth nor for their grandeur, but for the fire that reduced it all to ash. The Harrington legacy, once celebrated as a triumph of aristocracy, became instead a parable of corruption, pride, and downfall. And perhaps that is why the story still lingers, not simply as a tale of a house consumed by flames, but as a reminder of the fragile boundary between power and ruin, between reverence and resentment. The banquet was a moment of culmination, a final attempt to write their legacy in gold. Yet it ended with their name forever etched in smoke. The night of the Harrington banquet in 1897 began as a vision of perfection, a performance designed to etch the Harrington family's name forever into the annals of social prestige. From the moment the carriages arrived, wheels crunching against gravel paths lit by rows of lanterns, it was clear no expense had been spared. The manor stood resplendent against the evening sky, its windows glowing with the amber light of chandeliers, its stone facade draped in ivy and shadows. Guests described the approach as otherworldly, as though they were being ushered not simply into a party, but into another realm altogether. It was to be a night of music, laughter, and indulgence, a showcase of wealth in its most unapologetic form. Yet behind the shimmer of silverware and the perfume of roasted meats lingered something less tangible, something that only revealed itself once the festivities reached their crescendo. Inside the grand hall, the banquet unfolded in scenes that could have been lifted from the pages of a novel. The tables groaned under the weight of pheasants glazed in honey, venison roasted to perfection, and pies layered with fruit imported from France. Crystal goblets glittered under candlelight, filled and refilled with claret and champagne. The quartet, stationed in the corner near a towering fireplace, played melodies that threaded seamlessly through the air, binding the conversations and laughter into a rhythm as carefully composed as the music itself. Servants in immaculate livery moved in synchronized patterns, gliding between tables with the precision of dancers, their trays balancing delicate china and golden dishes. At first the guests marveled at the display, remarking on the abundance and the elegance with admiration. Some spoke of the Harringtons' generosity, others of their ostentation, but all agreed the evening was unlike anything Sussex had ever seen. Yet as the night wore on, a peculiar unease began to creep into the observations of those present. It was not the food or the music, both were flawless. It was the staff. Multiple accounts mentioned the servants moving with an unnatural rhythm, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed ahead as if they were actors rehearsing a play they had performed countless times before. One guest later remarked in a diary that the servants seemed as though bewitched, stripped of humanity, their smiles painted but their spirits elsewhere. The strangeness did not end there. When Lord Harrington rose to give his toast, raising a golden goblet high into the flickering light, the hall fell into an expectant hush. His words began with the expected notes: gratitude for his guests, pride in his family, and a declaration of the Harrington legacy. Yet several survivors recalled that midway through his speech, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed to thicken, heavy as though pressing down upon the lungs. The flicker of the candles slowed, their flames elongating unnaturally, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The quartet faltered for a moment, their bows trembling on the strings before recovering, though some claimed the notes they played afterward seemed dissonant, as if the instruments themselves resisted harmony. The toast concluded not with a cheer but with silence. Goblets were raised, but no sound of clinking followed, only the uneasy stillness of a hall that suddenly felt too vast, too watchful. Then, as if released from an unseen grip, the chatter resumed, though muted, uncertain. It was in this interlude between unease and normality that the night turned irrevocably. Accounts of the fire differ wildly, but certain details recur with disturbing consistency. Some guests swore the flames began in the kitchen, a sudden burst that leapt from pan to curtain and spread with unnatural speed. Others claimed they saw fire erupt along the tapestries in the hall itself, as though the walls had ignited from within. What all agree upon is the ferocity. Flames that consumed the wooden beams and velvet drapes faster than logic allowed, engulfing the hall in a matter of moments. The manor, built to endure centuries, surrendered to fire in the span of a single night. The chaos that followed defies full description. Survivors remembered guests screaming, gowns alight, men hurling chairs against windows that refused to break, as though the glass itself resisted escape. Servants, once so mechanical in their movements, now ran in frantic disarray, their expressions transformed into masks of terror. The quartet abandoned their instruments, yet one violin continued to play, its strings snapping in the heat but producing a sound some claimed resembled laughter. Others spoke of hearing voices within the blaze, not human voices but something deeper, resonant, mocking. One particularly haunting account came from a guest who staggered free of the inferno. She insisted she heard laughter rising above the roar of flames, laughter that did not belong to any person she knew. It was described as neither man nor woman, neither young nor old, but something ancient, something rejoicing. Another survivor swore he heard screams unlike any human cry, stretched into tones that made his bones ache. Whether these were hallucinations born of terror or something more cannot be known, but they became part of the folklore that clung to the event ever after. The fire spread with impossible haste. By the time villagers arrived, roused by the glow on the horizon and the acrid smoke carried on the wind, the manor was already collapsing. Walls crumbled, the roof caved in, and flames leapt skyward as if feeding on more than wood and flesh. Witnesses from the village spoke of shapes dancing within the fire, silhouettes that twisted and swayed in rhythm with the crackling blaze. Some swore they saw figures holding hands, circling as though in a grotesque waltz. Others described monstrous forms, hunched and leering, that vanished the moment they were glimpsed. Official records would later describe the event as an accident. The report filed by local authorities cited negligence in the kitchen, a grease fire left unattended, flames spreading through poorly maintained flues. It was, in bureaucratic language, a tragedy of mismanagement, nothing more. But among those who stood at the edges of the fire that night, the explanation rang hollow. They had seen too much, heard too much to believe it was mere accident. The most unsettling testimonies came from the surviving servants, though few dared speak openly. One young maid, her hair singed and her hands blistered, whispered to a villager that she had seen something enter the hall before the fire began. A figure cloaked in shadow, gliding across the floor unseen by the guests but felt by the staff. She insisted the shadow touched the tapestries and that where its hand lingered, flames followed. Another servant, shaken and silent for days, finally admitted that when the fire erupted, he saw Lord Harrington standing perfectly still, smiling, as though welcoming the destruction. These claims were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations, yet they persisted in hushed conversations, retold in the pubs and parlors of Sussex long after the ashes cooled. The folklore grew with each retelling. Some said the Harringtons had finally paid for their sins, that the fire was divine retribution for decades of greed and cruelty. Others whispered of a curse, perhaps tied to land seized unjustly, or to dealings carried out in shadows with consequences unseen. A few even suggested the fire was no accident nor curse but vengeance, an act carried out by the very servants who had been mistreated, their rebellion hidden beneath the official record. The lone servant who survived and fled into the night became both a figure of suspicion and of legend, cast alternately as a murderer and a hero. Yet even in the most rational accounts, unease lingers. Architects questioned how the fire could have consumed the manor so quickly, given its stone structure and supposed fireproofing. Chemists puzzled over why certain metals had melted in ways inconsistent with the blaze's recorded temperatures. And psychologists noted the uncanny uniformity in the testimonies of laughter, shadows, and impossible screams, details too consistent across survivors to be dismissed entirely as coincidence. The night of the feast thus endures not as a simple tale of fire, but as a tapestry of contradictions. On one side lies the official report, cold and clinical, attributing the disaster to human error and combustible architecture. On the other side lies the memory of those who lived it, of villagers who watched flames dance with shapes they could not name, of survivors who swore the fire spoke with voices not of this earth. Between these accounts stretches a gulf that no historian has yet bridged. What remains undeniable is the swiftness with which grandeur became ruin. In less than a single night, the Harrington legacy, centuries in the making, was reduced to charred beams and smoldering rubble. The feast that began with golden candelabras and honeyed pheasants ended with ash and silence. And yet even in destruction the Harrington name lived on, not as a symbol of wealth and power, but as a cautionary tale whispered across Sussex. The night of the feast became a story retold in taverns, inscribed in folklore and studied in hushed academic circles. It became, in short, something larger than history. It became legend. Suspicion, when it comes suddenly and mercilessly, rarely seeks proof. It clings to the figure who fits the narrative most easily. In the wake of the Harrington fire, When the last embers were still glowing against the black sky of Sussex, all fingers pointed toward a single man: Thomas Bellamy. He was not the most visible of the Harrington servants, nor the most trusted, but he was the one seen leaving the grounds that night, a dark figure slipping into the shadows before the blaze consumed the manor. His flight was enough to brand him guilty in the minds of many, and from that moment forward his name became inseparable from the inferno. Thomas Bellamy had served the Harrington family for nearly 2 decades. He began as a boy, sweeping hearths and hauling water, and worked his way into the role of footman, though he never advanced further. Where others rose into trusted positions, valets, butlers, stewards, Thomas remained fixed in place, a fixture of the household but never part of its inner circle. Accounts describe him as quiet, dutiful, yet carrying an undercurrent of resentment that manifested in sudden flashes of temper. He was known to mutter to himself, especially when alone in the stables or tending fires. Some remembered hearing fragments of his words, phrases about justice, about the arrogance of masters, about fire as the only true equalizer. These recollections, though perhaps colored by hindsight, would later paint him as a man smoldering long before the Harringtons' walls burst into flame. Historians who study the period portray Thomas as emblematic of the servant class in late Victorian England. The Harringtons, like many families of their stature, thrived on the silent labor of dozens who lived beneath their roof yet outside their esteem. Servants like Thomas were fed, clothed, and housed, but they were also expected to surrender individuality at the door. To be a servant was to efface oneself, to exist as a shadow of another's wealth. For some it was bearable, a station in life, no more or less. For Thomas it seemed a prison without chains. Diaries from fellow servants unearthed decades later reveal that he despised the rituals of obedience, the bowing, the phrases rehearsed to perfection, the constant reminder that his value was measured only by his ability to remain unseen. He said once, wrote one chambermaid, that the house was alive, but it only fed on us. We kept it warm, we polished it, we made it breathe, but it never gave us back a single kindness. Folklore, however, strips away the social commentary and paints Thomas in more sinister colors. In tales told around Sussex firesides, he became not merely a disgruntled man, but a vessel for something greater. A vessel of wrath, one priest declared from the pulpit shortly after the fire, his words echoing through the stone walls of St. Edmund's Church. To the faithful, Thomas was less a servant than an instrument, chosen or cursed to carry out divine judgment. They cited his mutterings about fire not as human resentment, but as prophecy. They whispered that he had long walked with a shadow at his back, that animals shied away from him, that children claimed to see a second face behind his own when the lamplight fell just right. These embellishments blurred the line between man and myth until Thomas himself became a story more than a subject. The evidence against him was circumstantial yet damning in the eyes of his contemporaries. Witnesses swore they saw him slip beyond the garden gate moments before the fire spread from the kitchens. His quarters contained scraps of charred paper, though no one ever determined whether they were remnants of letters, idle kindling, or something more. Villagers recalled overhearing him speak bitterly of the Harringtons in the weeks prior, claiming they fed on bones and that one day their banquet would turn to ashes. In the hysteria following the disaster, such words took on prophetic weight, interpreted less as frustration than as confession. But was Thomas Bellamy truly the architect of the fire, or was he the most convenient scapegoat? Some argued that his very existence made him disposable. He was a servant without family ties, without friends in high places, and without the means to defend himself against accusation. If the community needed someone to bear the weight of their terror, he was the obvious choice. The narrative of the embittered servant setting fire to his masters fit neatly into both social fears and moral lessons. It offered an explanation that was simple, human, and comprehensible, far easier than confronting the possibility of curses, shadows, or forces beyond understanding. Yet Thomas was not entirely a cipher. Fragments of his own voice survive, though few. Letters attributed to him, some preserved in parish archives, others in private collections, reveal a man caught between despair and fury. In one he wrote, "The walls watch me, but they never see me. I am the smoke they breathe out, but never thank. If fire comes, it will be because the house has longed for it." The handwriting is jagged, the tone oscillating between bitterness and fatalism. Psychologists, looking back, interpret these writings as evidence of trauma, perhaps even mental illness. They suggest that years of repression and humiliation might have erupted into destructive obsession, with fire serving as both metaphor and solution. To them, Thomas was not an instrument of wrath, but a man broken by a system designed to keep him voiceless. Still, the folklore refuses to let him rest in the realm of psychology. Stories persist that Thomas had been seen speaking to the flames in the manor's great hearth days before the banquet, whispering as though confiding in an old friend. Children in Sussex grew up hearing tales that he could conjure sparks with his bare hands, that he carried embers in his pockets without being burned, that his eyes glowed faintly red in moments of anger. None of these claims were ever substantiated, yet they endure in oral tradition, as though the community itself needed him to be more than human in order to account for what had transpired. The priest who labeled him a vessel of wrath described him in his sermons as chosen, not by God, but by forces older and darker. Some men, he intoned, are born hollow, and into their hollowness pours the anger of the earth. Bellamy was such a vessel. Parishioners left those services both fearful and relieved, fearful of what such a vessel might unleash, relieved to believe that the disaster had not been random, but the fulfillment of some grim necessity. In this way, Thomas's story became less about him and more about the community's attempt to impose order on chaos. Yet questions linger. Why was Thomas the only servant seen leaving? Why did he flee instead of raising alarm? Why did no evidence of arson, no accelerants, no tools ever surface? And why, if he was guilty, did he not boast or confess, but vanish into silence? These questions haunt historians, for while the narrative of vengeance is compelling, the gaps remain too wide to close with certainty. Some scholars suggest Thomas was indeed guilty, but not of arson, of desertion. They argue he fled not because he set the fire, but because he feared being blamed, knowing how swiftly suspicion would fall upon him. In leaving, he condemned himself to the role of scapegoat, his absence louder than any defense he might have spoken. Others argue that he did set the fire but was not fully conscious of it, acting in a trance-like state induced by years of rage or perhaps, as folklore insists, by possession. In this reading, Thomas was neither innocent nor fully culpable. He was the hand but not the will. Theories diverge further when considering his fate. Some say he was captured, tried, and executed quietly, his death concealed to preserve the Harringtons' dignity. Others insist he escaped entirely, wandering into the countryside and vanishing, perhaps living under another name, haunted by the fire he did or did not cause. Still others claim he was consumed by the blaze itself, his body mistaken for another's or never found, his supposed flight nothing more than an illusion crafted by smoke and panic. The lack of records ensures that his ending remains as contested as his guilt. To folklorists, the ambiguity is precisely the point. Thomas Bellamy becomes powerful not as a man of facts, but as a figure of myth. He is the servant who rose against his masters, the vessel who carried ancient vengeance, the victim of injustice, the ghost who still wanders the ruins. Each telling of his story reveals less about him and more about those who tell it, their fears, their needs, their hunger for meaning in the face of catastrophe. In this sense, Thomas transcends his humanity, becoming a mirror for the anxieties of Sussex across generations. What then was Thomas Bellamy? Was he a criminal who lit the match that destroyed a dynasty? Was he a scapegoat crushed beneath the weight of fear and class prejudice? Or was he, as some still whisper, chosen by forces older than himself, a vessel through whom the fire spoke? The evidence will never resolve these questions. But perhaps resolution is not the point. The Harrington fire resists closure, and Thomas Bellamy embodies that resistance. He is at once guilty and innocent, human and inhuman, victim and villain. In the shadows of history he remains unfinished, like the ruins of the Harrington estate, crumbled yet enduring, silent yet echoing with the memory of flames. In the weeks that followed the Harrington fire, the ruins were not merely smoldering timbers and collapsed stone. They were battlegrounds where two forces collided, science and superstition. Men in crisp coats with notebooks and measuring instruments walked among villagers who crossed themselves at every crackle of cooling ash. The fire inspectors, summoned from London, arrived with a set of conclusions already forming in their minds. To them, there was nothing mysterious in fire. It was a chemical reaction, a chain of predictable events: fuel, oxygen, heat, nothing more. The Harrington Manor, built in the late 18th century and wired with early electrical systems in the 1880s, was, in their view, a tinderbox waiting for ignition. Aging wires sparking behind velvet drapes combined with dry timber and drafty halls created the perfect storm for catastrophe. They declared it an accident. Tragic, yes, but wholly explicable. Yet for those who had watched the fire, who had seen not just flames but shapes moving within them, Such an explanation rang hollow. Villagers spoke of fire that seemed to leap not randomly but with intent, consuming certain rooms while sparing others. The great library, with its collection of rare theological texts, was reduced to dust, while the wine cellar below remained untouched. The ballroom, scene of the final toast, was incinerated almost entirely, while narrow servants' passages somehow retained sections of plaster and paint. Science described fire as indiscriminate, but those who stood beneath the night sky swore they had seen discrimination, a guiding hand within the chaos. Architects consulted on the case gave their own rational analysis. The Harrington estate, they argued, had been poorly maintained for decades. Records from town council archives show repeated warnings about the house's outdated chimneys, dry beams, and sagging rafters. They noted that heat naturally travels upward, explaining why the grand upper halls collapsed before the lower ones. To them, the strangeness was nothing more than the logic of physics misunderstood by frightened eyes. Yet even they could not deny the peculiar reports. Furniture that appeared charred in perfect outlines, doorways blackened while the rooms beyond remained unscathed. These patterns defied simple explanation, and while experts chalked them up to airflow and combustible materials, villagers whispered of selective fury, as though the fire had chosen where to feast. Physicians, too, weighed in, though not on the fire itself but on its aftermath. They examined survivors and witnesses, diagnosing shock, hysteria, and what one doctor termed collective delusion. In their assessment, the villagers had not truly seen what they claimed. Exhaustion, fear, and the hypnotic nature of flames had distorted their perceptions. Memories, fragile and malleable, had twisted into visions of shadows dancing or laughter echoing in the inferno. In the physician's report, filed neatly in the county records, there is a striking line: the mind under terror manufactures demons faster than science can erase them. For the medical establishment, the Harrington fire was not supernatural, it was psychological. But the villagers would not let go of their stories. They insisted the fire had a voice, a rhythm, almost a personality. Some claimed it roared not with the chaotic crackle of burning wood but with something deeper, like chants carried on wind. One woman swore she saw figures in the flames moving in time with the string quartet that had played earlier that night, as though the music continued in a darker key. Others described screams that did not belong to the human guests, cries layered and alien, tearing through the smoke. For them, these were not delusions. They were truths that science refused to recognize. The tension between these accounts mirrored a broader cultural divide of the era. The late 19th century was an age of contradictions. It was the height of industrial progress, electric lights, telegraphs, advances in medicine, yet it was also the golden age of spiritualism. Seance flourished in parlors, mediums claimed to channel the dead, and photographs of ghostly apparitions circulated with both fascination and skepticism. The public lived in two worlds at once, the rational world of science and the enchanted world of superstition. The Harrington fire became a stage where these two realities collided. Newspapers reflected this divide. The London Times ran a sober piece citing fire inspectors, declaring the disaster a tragic but wholly natural consequence of neglected maintenance. Meanwhile, local Sussex papers printed testimonies from villagers describing faces in the flames and a shadow in the smoke that walked against the wind. One editorial dared to suggest that the Harringtons, with their wealth and rumored cruelty, had drawn down judgment from beyond. The competing narratives spread like sparks on the wind, ensuring that the fire's legacy would never be contained by official reports alone. Folklorists have since argued that the villagers clinging to superstition was less about ignorance and more about meaning. Science could explain how the fire spread, but it could not explain why it happened on that night, during that feast, wiping out nearly the entire household. Superstition offered an answer, however frightening. The fire had purpose. It was vengeance, or a curse, or the release of something bound within the Harrington walls. In this way, superstition gave shape to grief and chaos, transforming random tragedy into narrative justice. For those who had lost neighbors, friends, or family members in the blaze, such stories offered not just fear but also comfort. Modern historians approach the event with caution, acknowledging both the technical plausibility of accidental fire and the persistence of supernatural belief. They note that memory, once entwined with fear, rarely untangles. A villager who thought he saw a figure in the flames might later describe it with greater certainty, especially when reinforced by others' stories. Over time, the folklore solidified into legend, until the supernatural became inseparable from the historical record. Even now, Researchers who visit the ruins, little more than scattered stones and overgrown foundations, report a lingering unease, as though centuries of retold stories have left an imprint on the land itself. But science, persistent and unyielding, continues to assert its claim. Fire analysis conducted decades later, using modern techniques, suggests the blaze spread in ways consistent with chimney sparks igniting dry rafters. Samples of preserved wood, when tested, reveal the presence of creosote buildup, a highly flammable residue. Engineers studying photographs of the ruins argue that the strange burn patterns were likely caused by differences in ventilation and the flammability of specific materials. From this perspective, every mystery has an answer. The Harrington fire was tragic but ordinary, and yet ordinary does not linger in the human imagination. It does not inspire whispered tales by candlelight or sermons warning of divine wrath. The villagers' insistence on superstition may not align with laboratory certainty, but it speaks to another kind of truth, that fear itself has power. A fire may begin with faulty wiring, but once it rages through the night, once it devours a dynasty, it ceases to be mere chemistry. It becomes story, myth, warning. It becomes more than the sum of its parts. So the question remains, was the Harrington fire a simple accident, or was it something more? Was it merely the science of combustion playing out against the backdrop of an opulent feast? Or was it a manifestation of the era's deepest anxieties? The fear that wealth hides corruption, that houses conceal curses, that the dead do not rest quietly? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between science and superstition, but in recognizing that the two are not always at odds. For even when science explains, superstition persists, because it speaks to the human need for meaning in the face of chaos. And so the ruins of the Harrington estate remain a testament to this tension. Inspectors saw faulty wires, architects saw weak beams, physicians saw hysteria. Villagers saw judgment, shadows, and flames with intent. Both sides continue to tell their stories, and between them lies a truth we may never resolve. For perhaps the fire was only fire, or perhaps it was something that walked within the fire, something science cannot measure, something that superstition, in its trembling way, glimpsed more clearly than reason ever could. Legends are not born in moments of clarity, but in the aftermath of tragedy, when truth collapses under the weight of memory, when voices clash, and when silence leaves space for the imagination to run wild. The Harrington fire, though documented in newspapers and coroners' reports, has long since transcended the limits of historical fact. What remains is something far more enduring, a legend whispered across Sussex, carried down generations, reshaped by each teller. To some, the Harringtons were punished by divine judgment for their arrogance. To others, the blaze was a servant's rebellion, magnified into myth by fearful villagers. And to still others, the fire was no earthly event at all, but the manifestation of something ancient, a force that does not tolerate pride. However it is framed, one truth is inescapable. The Harrington banquet continues to haunt. The first legends emerged almost immediately after the smoke cleared. Villagers who had gathered at dawn to watch the mansion smolder gave their own accounts. Some swore they saw faces in the fire, screaming not in pain but in laughter, as though mocking the living who stared on helplessly. Others insisted the flames had a deliberate pattern, skipping one wing of the estate entirely, leaving a section of hallway intact, while annihilating the grand dining room down to its bones. To them, this was not the randomness of a blaze but evidence of intent, as though the fire itself had chosen where to strike. These earliest murmurs, carried by grief and fear, became the foundation for every tale that followed. Religious interpretations soon emerged. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the Harringtons had been punished for vanity, excess, and cruelty. The timing of the fire, the night of a lavish banquet, where food and wine flowed endlessly while nearby villagers struggled through famine, was portrayed as no coincidence. In sermons, the fire became an allegory, the fate of those who mock the humble and worship wealth. Parish records from the late 1890s show spikes in attendance after the tragedy, as locals sought both comfort and warning from the event. For decades, it was said that mothers would invoke the Harringtons when scolding greedy children, reminding them that pride invites ruin. The estate, once a symbol of power, was reduced in folklore to a cautionary tale. But beyond the church, the villagers spun darker versions. They told of Thomas Bellamy, the servant scapegoated for the blaze, not merely as a man of flesh but as something more. In pubs and farmhouses, whispers grew. Bellamy had been chosen, his rage merely the vessel through which a curse struck. Some claimed the Harringtons had wronged gypsies who once camped near their land, and that Bellamy became the unwilling hand of their revenge. Others said the family had unearthed something buried beneath the estate, bones, an idol or a relic better left untouched, and that their banquet awakened what had slept. The details varied wildly, but the thread remained constant. The fire was not only an accident of wood and spark, but an act of vengeance orchestrated by forces unseen. As decades passed, the ruins themselves became the stage upon which new legends flourished. Children dared each other to sneak onto the grounds, swearing they heard music drifting from the charred ballroom long after midnight. Farmers claimed that candles relit themselves when placed upon the dining table, though any attempt to remove the table from the ruins failed. The wood, blackened but unbroken, was said to resist all axes and saws. Local hunters spoke of laughter echoing across the fields, though no one was there to laugh. Each story embellished the mystery, drawing more curious souls to the site. What had once been tragedy evolved into a kind of theater, where the ruins were both stage and actor. Urban explorers of the 20th century carried the story further, documenting their adventures into the crumbling estate. Grainy photographs captured strange phenomena, blurs of light that resembled figures, reflections in shattered mirrors, or scorch marks that seemed to shift between visits. One widely circulated tale from the 1960s claimed that a group of students, camping near the ruins, heard the unmistakable sound of cutlery clinking and glasses toasting, though no one was inside. When they fled, they swore the dining hall glowed faintly as if illuminated by candlelight. Skeptics dismissed such accounts as tricks of light or intoxication, yet the allure of the Harrington legend only deepened with every report. Folklorists found the story irresistible. In university lectures, the Harrington fire was presented as an archetypal tale: wealth destroyed by hubris, innocence consumed, vengeance rising from below. Scholars traced the parallels between the Harrington banquet and myths from other cultures: the fall of feasting kings in Norse sagas, the punished banquet of Belshazzar in the Bible, or the doomed revels of Greek tragedies. The Harringtons, it was argued, became avatars of a universal narrative, that no feast, however grand, can outlast the shadow of mortality and judgment. Academic journals noted that the persistence of the legend, despite evidence pointing to accidental fire, spoke more to human psychology than history. People needed the story to mean something. To reduce it to faulty wiring or a kitchen mishap was unsatisfying. To frame it as curse, vengeance, or divine reckoning gave it weight. Still, not all accounts leaned on morality or myth. Paranormal investigators began circling the estate in the late 20th century, armed with tape recorders and infrared cameras. They reported anomalies, sudden temperature drops, unaccountable static on recordings, or faint whispers captured in empty rooms. Some claimed to hear laughter layered under the crackle of static. Others swore their equipment malfunctioned whenever aimed at the dining table. These findings, while never scientifically verified, fueled documentaries and late-night radio shows, where the Harrington fire became a case study in intelligent hauntings. If the fire had devoured souls, as some villagers once claimed, perhaps those souls never left. Yet alongside these believers stood skeptics determined to unravel the legend. They argued that every haunting at the ruins could be explained by natural causes: wind whistling through broken stone, rodents scurrying across wood, moonlight refracting through shattered glass. The photographs of strange figures were dismissed as motion blur, the glowing dining hall as phosphorescent fungi feeding on damp rot. Psychologists suggested that visitors primed with tales of curses were more likely to interpret ordinary sounds as supernatural. In their view, the Harrington legend persisted not because it was real, but because it satisfied the human hunger for narrative. But even skeptics could not deny the endurance of the tale. The Harrington fire has been retold in plays, adapted into novels, and reimagined in ghost tours that draw tourists from across England. Actors recreate the banquet in candlelit halls, stopping the performance abruptly to plunge the audience into darkness, mimicking the moment the fire began. Around campfires, children repeat the story with their own embellishments, each generation reshaping the details but preserving the core. In some versions, the Harringtons made a pact with the devil, sealed with wine and laughter. In others, the banquet was already cursed, doomed by the blood spilled in the construction of the estate. The fire, then, was not the end of the story but its beginning. What is striking is how the legend adapts to each era. In the Victorian age, it was framed as divine punishment for arrogance. In the early 20th century, it became a tale of supernatural vengeance and class rebellion. In the spiritualist movement, it was linked to seances and restless spirits. In the late 20th century, it was claimed as evidence for paranormal research. And today, in the digital age, the Harrington fire lives online, shared in podcasts, horror forums, and viral videos. Each retelling strips and rebuilds the story but never extinguishes it. If anything, technology has breathed new life into the embers. The power of the Harrington legend lies not in evidence but in emotion. The facts of the fire, date, casualty count, and destruction are the skeleton. But it is fear, awe, and imagination that provide the flesh. To believe the Harringtons were punished is to accept that the world has moral order. To believe Bellamy was chosen as a vessel is to embrace the notion that humans can be pawns of forces beyond comprehension. To believe the fire itself had intent is to admit that even nature may harbor will. Each interpretation says more about the storyteller than the event, reflecting personal fears, cultural anxieties, or collective guilt. And so the ruins remain, half swallowed by ivy, open to wind and rain. They are not empty, for emptiness is impossible in a place so saturated with memory. Visitors stand before the blackened dining table and swear it hums faintly, as though remembering the weight of silver cutlery and spilled wine. Others kneel by the stones and feel heat lingering, though the fire burned more than a century ago. Whether one believes these sensations are supernatural or psychological hardly matters. The experience is real enough to those who tremble before it. The Harrington legend is not about solving a mystery. It is about preserving one. For in the ashes of the banquet lies a truth that no evidence can erase. Humanity is bound to stories, especially those that dance between reason and terror. The Harrington fire endures because it refuses to be explained, because it resists closure, because it allows every generation to confront the question of whether fate, vengeance, or sheer chaos governs the world. That is why the legend will not die. It does not belong to the Harringtons, nor to Bellamy, nor to Sussex. It belongs to us all. The Harrington estate has long since crumbled, its once grand halls reclaimed by ivy and silence. The banquet table, if it still exists, lies somewhere beneath collapsed beams in the shifting soil of Sussex. Yet the feast itself lingers, not in wood or stone, but in memory and rumor, in folklore that has refused to fade. For more than a century, the Harrington fire has resisted a single explanation, surviving instead as a question that every generation must answer anew. Was it accident, crime, curse, or something older than any of those words can contain? Historians, bound by record and reason, insist the blaze was nothing more than the cruelty of chance. A kitchen fire spreading too fast through aging timber. They point to building plans, charred beams, and the simple reality that houses burn. Psychologists see another truth. The survivors, traumatized and guilt-stricken, reimagined what they had witnessed, giving the flames voices and laughter because the silence of death was unbearable. In their view, the legend is less about the Harringtons and more about the human mind, forever trying to impose order on chaos. But folklore has always walked a different path. Villagers still whisper that Thomas Bellamy returned that night, not merely as a man, but as shadow. They say he moved unseen, his anger transformed into something elemental, until the fire itself obeyed his will. Others insist the feast had been cursed long before Bellamy ever lit a match, cursed by greed, by arrogance, by the bones of the forgotten buried beneath the estate. For them, the fire was not a beginning but an ending written long ago. And then there are the stories that refuse even those categories. They describe the fire as conscious, deliberate, choosing which rooms to devour and which to leave untouched. They tell of laughter within the blaze that was neither human nor divine, but something in between. These stories linger not because they can be proven, but because they haunt the imagination more deeply than any official report. What endures is an image, fragile yet indelible. Candlelight flickering on silverware, crystal glasses raised in a toast. The Harrington family smiling as though their legacy would never fade. Behind them, a servant stands in shadow, silent, unblinking, watching. A moment later, fire erupts, consuming celebration and flesh alike, leaving behind only ash and speculation. That is the vision that has survived the test of time, the vision that no archive or skeptic can erase. Perhaps Thomas Bellamy carried his secret to the grave. Perhaps the truth was swallowed by the fire itself. Or perhaps the feast continues still, burning endlessly in a place beyond our sight where music and screams intertwine. The question remains, as it always has. Was it crime, curse, or something far older that turned a celebration into ash?